When people hear the word Vikings, they often imagine raiders, warriors, and longships cutting through foggy seas. But the Norse world was far more complex than just conquest and battle. Behind their rugged image lay a structured society governed by laws, assemblies, and a surprising amount of democratic practice, especially for the time. Understanding how the Vikings ruled means understanding the foundation of their legal system, their societal values, and how they balanced personal honor with communal responsibility. At the heart of Viking governance was a powerful idea. Law was not given by kings or gods, but maintained by the people themselves. Norse societies, particularly in Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, operated through assemblies known as things, local and regional gatherings, where free men came together to make decisions, settle disputes, and shape the rules of their communities. The idea of the thing wasn't just about law enforcement, it was the very expression of Viking self-rule. Every free man had the right to attend and speak at the thing. While not every voice carried the same weight status, wealth and alliances still mattered. It was still a forum for negotiation, debate, and decision-making by consensus. For a society that lived on the edge of survival in harsh northern climates, cooperation was not just noble, it was necessary. These things operated at various levels. The smallest were local things, held in villages or small regions. Larger things, like the Gulaing in Norway or the Altingi in Iceland, brought together representatives from across vast territories. The Altingi, established around 930 AD, is especially remarkable. It's one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world, predating many later European systems by centuries. But Viking democracy did not mean equality in the modern sense. Only free men had a voice. Women, slaves, and non-landowners were excluded from political life. That said, Viking women did enjoy more rights and autonomy than many of their counterparts in medieval Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and in some cases, wield significant influence behind the scenes. The Viking legal system was oral, relying on the memory and authority of designated legal specialists called law speakers. These individuals memorized the laws of their region and recited them during assemblies. Law speakers were deeply respected, acting as both judges and historians. Their role shows how law was not just a matter of enforcement, but also storytelling, a shared narrative that defined who the people were and how they chose to live. Laws in Viking society were not static. They evolved, adapted, and were reshaped through dialogue at the thing. If a law no longer served the community, it could be debated and changed. This flexibility gave Viking law its strength. It was alive, tied to the will and needs of the people. In a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, this grassroots approach was revolutionary. Disputes were not just settled by punishment, but often through compensation. The concept of wergild or man price assigned a monetary value to a person's life depending on their social status. If someone was injured or killed, the responsible party could pay a wergild to the victim's family to settle the matter. It was a system designed to prevent blood feuds and keep peace in tightly knit communities. However, if compensation wasn't accepted or paid, violence could erupt. Honor and vengeance were still potent forces. This tension between personal honor and communal law is key to understanding Viking rule. People were expected to defend their rights and the rights of their families, but also to submit disputes to the judgment of the thing. The balance was delicate and not always peaceful. Yet the fact that Viking societies tried to resolve conflict through law at all rather than sheer violence is what makes their system so remarkable. Viking governance wasn't centralized. There were no vast bureaucracies or sprawling empires. Power was dispersed among chieftains, assemblies, and local communities. In many ways, this made their society resilient. Local leaders had autonomy, but were still accountable to their peers at the thing. This also meant leadership was earned and often contested. A chieftain had to maintain the loyalty of his followers, not through force, but through generosity, fairness, and respect. To rule in the Viking world was to persuade, to share wealth, and to uphold law, not to command blindly. That might sound far from the image of axe-swinging berserkers, but it's the truth behind the longships and legends. This balance of personal freedom, communal law, and evolving tradition formed the foundation of Viking rule. It wasn't perfect, no system is, but it was ahead of its time in many ways. The idea that power should come from the people, that laws could be debated, and that justice was a shared responsibility. These were radical concepts in a world where kings and emperors ruled with absolute authority. In Viking society, power didn't flow from a throne or palace. It flowed from the Thingen institution that sat at the very center of Norse governance. The Thing wasn't a building or an elite council. It was a gathering, a ritual, a conversation. It was where law was spoken aloud, where justice was negotiated, and where collective decision-making came to life. If Viking society had a heartbeat, it pulsed through the Thing. The word thing, from Old Norse seating, referred both to the assembly itself and to the legal process it facilitated. But it wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about creating them, maintaining social balance, and defining what it meant to be part of the community. This was a society that valued autonomy, but also order. The thing was how they made those two forces coexist. Every free man had the right to attend the thing. This was not symbolic participation. Attendance was expected, and sometimes mandatory. In a land without a standing army or centralized law enforcement, every adult male was both a citizen and a guardian of justice. The more people present, the more legitimate the decision. Things were held outdoors, often on hills, fields, or near natural landmarks. Some thing sites were used for centuries and are still marked today. They weren't just political gatherings. They were festivals. People came not only to debate and judge, but to trade goods, hear news, arrange marriages, and settle personal disputes. Food, drink, and storytelling were part of the experience. There were multiple levels of the thing. Local things might cover a single valley or district. Regional things brought together larger communities. And at the highest level were the national things like the Alþingi in Iceland or the Gulaing in Norway, which drew representatives from vast areas. At the heart of each thing was the law speaker, or lögsögumaður in Old Norse. His role was essential. In a pre-literate society, law wasn't written, it was remembered. The law speaker had to recite the laws from memory, often over several days. His words carried legal weight. If he forgot a law or misstated it, the consequences could ripple across generations. The law speaker also presided over the debates, interpreted laws, and ensured that procedures were followed. But he was not a ruler. He didn't pass judgments or enforce verdicts. That responsibility lay with the assembly itself. In this way, the thing was both court and Congress, where the people were the lawmakers and the jury. One of the most striking features of the thing was its emphasis on consensus. Decisions were rarely made by simple majority vote. Instead, the goal was to reach an agreement everyone could accept or at least live with. This was more time-consuming, but it encouraged compromise and dialogue. For the Vikings, unity wasn't forced from above, it was built from below through speech and negotiation. When a dispute was brought to the thing, it could take several forms: a personal grievance, a claim of injury or theft, or even a charge of murder. Parties would bring witnesses, offer oaths, and make their case in front of the assembly. Sometimes the accused would confess and seek settlement. Other times, the crowd would deliberate, weigh reputations, and come to a judgment. In many cases, payment of wergild, monetary compensation, resolved the issue. But if parties refused the decision of the thing, the consequences could escalate into feud or exile. The thing's authority extended beyond criminal law. It regulated land ownership, trade rights, marriage rules, and religious practices. It had the power to banish individuals, strip someone of legal protection, or declare entire families as outlaws, meaning anyone could kill them without penalty. Such punishments were rare but severe, reserved for those who threatened the balance of society. Despite being male-dominated, the thing wasn't completely closed to women. In some cases, widows or heiresses could bring cases to the thing. And while they didn't vote or speak publicly in most assemblies, Viking women often influenced decisions through family ties and informal negotiation. In some sagas, we see women pushing their husbands or sons to pursue justice or vengeance at the thing. Over time, as Christianity spread and centralized monarchies emerged, the role of the thing began to change. Kings sought to use the assembly to strengthen their own authority, sometimes appointing royal officials to oversee proceedings. Written law codes gradually replaced oral tradition. But even then, the legacy of the thing endured. The Alþingi, for example, remained a cornerstone of Icelandic society even after the island came under Norwegian and then Danish rule. It was temporarily abolished in the 19th century, but later restored, and today it serves as the national parliament of Iceland. Its origins in Viking democracy are not just a source of national pride, but a reminder of the Norse commitment to participatory rule. What made the thing extraordinary wasn't its structure, but its spirit. It was loud, messy, and imperfect, but it was free. It showed that in the Norse world, power didn't belong solely to kings or warriors. It belonged to the community, to those who showed up, spoke out, and upheld the law with their voices and their presence. In the age of swords and longships, the Vikings believed in the power of speech. That belief shaped their world and continues to echo through time. For the Vikings, the concept of justice was deeply intertwined with personal honor, social balance, and communal memory. Law wasn't just a set of rules, it was an evolving agreement between individuals who lived closely together in often harsh and unforgiving environments. Disputes could flare into blood feuds, and the survival of the community depended on resolving conflict without undermining personal dignity or collective harmony. In this context, Viking law emerged not as an abstract system imposed from above, but as a social contract shaped and enforced by the people themselves. At its center was the principle of compensation rather than incarceration. The most famous example of this is the wergildaman's price. Wergild was a fixed amount of money or goods owed as restitution for an injury or killing. The amount varied depending on the status of the victim. A free man had a higher wergild than a thrall slave. A chieftain's value was higher than a farmer's. This wasn't just about economics, it reflected the importance of each individual's role in society. The wergild acknowledged that harm had been done and allowed for justice without endless revenge. If the offender or their family paid the required amount, the matter was considered settled. If they refused, or if the payment was rejected by the victim's kin, the dispute could escalate into a blood feud. These feuds, though legally recognized, were dangerous and destabilizing. Thus, the law encouraged resolution through payment and public acknowledgement rather than violence. Oaths played a vital role in Viking justice. When formal evidence was lacking, it often was individuals could swear an oath of innocence, sometimes supported by oath helpers or compurgators. These were respected members of the community who would vouch for the person's honesty. If enough trustworthy people stood by the accused, their word could tip the balance in a legal case. Trial by ordeal was occasionally used, though far less commonly than in other medieval cultures. In some areas, an accused might have to hold a red-hot iron or retrieve a stone from boiling water, with the condition that if the wounds healed cleanly, they were considered innocent. But more often, Viking legal culture preferred verbal testimony, public accountability, and negotiated settlements. The thing was the arena where these principles were enacted, but local enforcement relied on the community. There were no police in Viking society. If someone was declared guilty and refused to pay or submit, it fell to the injured party, and their kinto enforced the decision. In this way, law and honor were inseparable. To ignore a legal ruling was not just unlawful, it was dishonorable. One particularly harsh form of punishment was outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to lose all legal protection. Anyone could kill or rob the outlaw without facing consequences. It was a social death sentence, often leading to exile, isolation, or a violent end. Outlawry served as a powerful deterrent. Being cut off from society was often more feared than imprisonment or fines. Still, the law could also be forgiving. In many cases, Those who broke the rules could regain status by paying restitution, performing public penance, or negotiating with their community. Viking justice was more concerned with restoring order than punishing offenders for its own sake. It wasn't driven by ideology or revenge, but by pragmatism and the need to keep fragile communities intact. Women in Viking society, though excluded from formal legal power, could be active participants in legal matters. They could inherit property, sue for divorce, and bring certain types of cases before the thing. In some sagas, women are seen using the law to defend their rights, claim land, or avenge a family member. While they did not serve as law speakers or judges, their voices were not absent from the legal sphere. Law also governed land ownership, trade, and alliances. Disputes over property boundaries, grazing rights, or broken trade deals were all handled through the legal process. Because wealth was closely tied to land and livestock, clarity in these matters was essential. Some laws dictated how many witnesses were needed to validate a land sale, or how long a person had to live on a plot before claiming ownership. In a world where kings were often far away or didn't exist at all, the law filled the void. It created predictability in a time of uncertainty. It told people what was expected of them and what they could expect in return. And it gave a measure of security to even the weakest members of society, provided they could find allies to defend their rights. It's important to understand that Viking law was not utopian. It favored free men, property holders, and those with strong family connections. Slaves had almost no rights. Foreigners had fewer protections. But even within its limitations, the Norse legal system stands out for its emphasis on transparency, community engagement, and resistance to arbitrary rule. Unlike in many other medieval societies, where laws were handed down by monarchs or priests, the Vikings believed that law belonged to the people. It had to be spoken aloud, remembered collectively, and defended publicly. That belief made the law both sacred and accessible. It wasn't locked in books, it lived in the memory of the law speaker, the debates of the thing, and the choices of the people. Honor and justice were two sides of the same coin. To live justly was to live honorably, and to act with honor was to respect the law, uphold your promises, and accept the judgment of your peer seven when it went against you. This culture of accountability didn't make the Viking world peaceful, but it made it durable. Through centuries of change-raids, migrations, Christianization, the commitment to law and communal governance remained a defining trait of Norse culture. It was a rough, pragmatic, and deeply human system. Not a perfect democracy, but something that carried its spirit long before that word existed. In Viking society, leadership was not defined by crowns or palaces, but by loyalty, influence, and the ability to maintain order and provide for one's people. Chieftains, jarls, and kings existed, but they ruled not by divine right or absolute authority. Their power came from the trust of those they leaded. That power could be lost as easily as it was gained. Unlike the feudal systems developing elsewhere in medieval Europe, Viking leadership was fluid and often decentralized. There were no fixed hierarchies across the Norse world. Instead, leadership roles were rooted in personal bonds, mutual benefit, and shared interest. A leader who failed to fulfill his duties, such as distributing wealth, protecting the community, or speaking justly at the thing, could quickly lose the support of his followers. At the local level, the most common authority figure was the Gothi in Iceland, or chieftain in broader Norse culture. The Gothi combined religious, legal, and political responsibilities. He would represent his followers at the thing, lead them in times of war, and host major festivals or feasts. But his authority depended on his ability to give more than he took. Generosity was essential. This concept is often referred to as the gift economy. A good leader was expected to redistribute his wealth typically gained from trade, raids, or inheritance among his supporters. Gifts weren't simply acts of kindness. They were tools of power. A chieftain who gave gold, weapons, food, or land forged strong personal bonds. Those who received were expected to offer loyalty in return. Feasting played a vital role in this relationship. Hosting large gatherings of free men was a way for leaders to display their wealth and status. These events served both social and political functions, reinforcing hierarchy, cementing alliances, and reminding people of the leader's value to the community. A leader who failed to host such gatherings was seen as weak or miserly. Despite this hierarchy, Viking society valued independence. The ideal leader wasn't a tyrant but a first among equals. He was expected to listen, to mediate, and to carry the will of his people. If he acted unfairly or became arrogant, his followers could abandon him or challenge him. Leadership could change hands without war or bloodshed, simply through a shift in allegiance. In more centralized regions like Denmark and Sweden, kings did emerge with stronger political control. But even then, they were constrained by tradition and required the approval of regional assemblies. No king ruled alone. Even the most powerful monarchs had to negotiate with landowners, warriors, and local leaders. If a king was unjust, the people could resist his ruler. In extreme cases, remove him entirely. There are historical examples of this. In Norway, the unification efforts of kings like Harald Fairhair met resistance from local chieftains who feared losing their autonomy. In Iceland, there was no king at all during the Viking Age. The country was governed by a network of Goðar and the Alþingi, with power shared and contested in a more horizontal structure. This lack of central monarchy allowed Iceland to preserve its unique legal system for centuries. Justice and leadership were inseparable. Leaders were expected to uphold the law, not override it. At the Thing, even the highest-ranking chieftain could be challenged by a free farmer if the argument was sound. The idea that anyone, regardless of birth, could participate in legal debate or witness a case was revolutionary for its time. It helped keep leaders accountable and prevented the unchecked concentration of power. What's also striking is the Viking emphasis on reputation. In a world where written contracts were rare and law was spoken, a person's word and honor were their currency. A leader who broke promises or failed to pay debts would be remembered and publicly shamed. Saga literature is full of tales where prideful kings fall, not in battle, but because they dishonored themselves through cowardice, betrayal, or injustice. This deep connection between reputation and rule meant that Viking leaders often acted as role models. They were expected to embody courage, wisdom, fairness, and generosity. They led from the front in battle and spoke last in the Thing. Their strength came not just from their sword, but from their ability to listen, compromise, and carry the weight of the law. The Viking world was not an egalitarian utopia. Wealth and lineage still mattered, and those with resources had more influence. But their system discouraged unchecked power. Authority was always conditional. Power had to be renewed constantly through acts of leadership, gestures of generosity, and respect for the shared laws of the community. Even religion supported this vision. The Norse gods, especially figures like Odin and Thor, were not distant deities demanding obedience. They were fallible, often flawed, and deeply involved in the human world. They made oaths, sought knowledge, and upheld justice in their own chaotic ways. These stories reinforced a worldview where leaders were not divine rulers, but active participants in the moral fabric of society. As the Viking Age came to a close, many of these systems evolved. Kings consolidated power, Christianity introduced new hierarchies, and written law replaced oral tradition. But the legacy of Norse governance remained. The idea that leadership must be accountable, that law belongs to the people, and that justice requires participation, these principles survived. They lived on in Scandinavian political culture, influenced the formation of early parliamentary systems, and inspired democratic ideals centuries later. The Vikings may be remembered for their ships and swords, but their greatest achievement may have been how they ruled together through speech, memory, and a stubborn belief in fairness. In a time of chaos and conflict, the Vikings built order not with thrones or empires, but with words, honor, and trust. That legacy is still felt today. You've heard the stories. Naked warriors howling like wolves, eyes burning with madness. charging into battle without fear or armor. They were called berserkers. But were they real? The term berserker comes from Old Norse, likely berserker, meaning bear shirt, as in wearing a bear pelt. Others interpret it as bear shirt, suggesting they fought without armor. Both translations reflect the same brutal idea. These were not ordinary warriors. They were possessed. They appear in the Icelandic saga's semi-historical, semi-mythical stories of Viking heroes. According to these tales, berserkers could not be harmed by iron or fire. They bit their shields. They roared. They felt no pain. They were Odin's chosen, his special forces on the battlefield. In Ynglinga Saga, Snorri Sturluson wrote that Odin's men went without armor and acted like mad dogs or wolves. They bit their shields, were strong as bears or bulls, and killed men with a single blow. This is one of the oldest written accounts from the 13th century describing berserker rage. But let's be clear, the sagas were written long after the Viking Age had ended. They're full of exaggeration, drama, and myth. So the big question is, were berserkers real people or just poetic creations? The line between Viking myth and Viking history is thin. Berserkers might have been a real cult of warriors, but we can't take the sagas literally. Still, multiple sources, not just sagas, mention berserkers. From poems and law codes to Christian chroniclers horrified by their savagery. In fact, berserkers were even outlawed in Norway by the year 1015. King Eric outlawed going berserk. Not just the people, but the state of frenzy itself. It was too violent, too chaotic, even for a warrior society like the Norse. So what was this so-called berserker gang, or berserker fury? Was it just psychological? Religious? Fueled by drugs or alcohol? Or was it something deeper? In Norse belief, warriors could shape-shift spiritually, if not physically. The bear and the wolf weren't just animals, they were totems of power. Berserkers took on that energy, fighting as if they became the beast. It wasn't just about killing. It was about becoming more than human, becoming myth. But belief is not the same as fact. And history is rarely kind to legends. War was clear. They wanted to leave their human selves behind and become a vessel for something greater, animal, divine, or both. This is supported by numerous references to them wearing animal pelts, especially of bears or wolves. These weren't costumes. They were sacred garb, symbols of their spiritual identity. In fact, another group of warriors, the Ulfhednar, were said to channel wolves rather than bears. They fought in similar frenzy, believed to be Odin's chosen as well. Both berserkers and Ulfhednar likely had rituals before battle. These may have included fasting, chanting, dancing, or blood offerings. Their rituals were not unlike shamanic practices, an attempt to pierce the veil between the physical and spiritual world. This connection to shamanism may explain the reports of their superhuman feats and strange behavior. There's also a social explanation. In Viking society, reputation was everything. A man known for losing control in battle, feared by all, gained fame. That fame could translate to power, leadership, and honor. Becoming a berserker may have been as much about social strategy as religious fervor. By cultivating their fearsome image, these men carved out a unique status in a warrior-dominated world. Yet not everyone admired them. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, berserkers became targets of reform. Their behavior was seen as pagan, chaotic, and unholy. Laws were introduced to punish those who went berserk. By the 12th century, they were no longer seen as elite warriors, but as outlaws, madmen, or worse. The age of the berserker was fading. But even as they disappeared, their legend grew. In sagas, they became monstrous. In poetry, they became symbols of rage. In folklore, they became cautionary tales. But at their core, they were men, flesh and blood, trying to transcend their limits. Berserker rage wasn't just about brute force. It was more than a method of fighting. It was a ritual, a transformation, and possibly even a form of worship. For the Norse, battle was never just physical. It was spiritual. To fight in the name of Odin was to surrender your body to something wild and divine. Berserkers may have believed they were not just warriors but chosen vessels for gods and beasts. In Norse mythology, Odin is not just the god of war. He is also the god of madness, poetry, and death. He seeks knowledge at any cost, even sacrificing his own eye. He is a wanderer, a shapeshifter, and a master of magic. The berserker's fury, the berserker gang, can be seen as a gifter, a curse from Odin himself. It was said that Odin could give his warriors strength beyond normal men and shield them from pain or injury. But this power came at a price: loss of control, isolation, and eventual rejection by society. The Norse concept of hamrith, a shape or spirit of a person, may help explain the berserker state. According to this belief, the soul could shift or expand. A man could adopt the hamr of a bear or wolf and become that creature in spirit, if not in body. Some sagas even tell of men who physically took on the form of animals, though this was likely metaphorical. In reality, the berserker may have entered a trance-like state so deep that his very identity seemed to change. This ritualized transformation can be compared to shamanic practices seen in other cultures. Shamans often enter altered states through dancing, chanting, fasting, or consuming substances. In this state, they communicate with spirits or channel otherworldly power. Berserkers may have done something similar, not for healing or prophecy, but for war. The battle was their sacred space. The enemy was their offering. The frenzy was not random. It followed a pattern. First, the warrior became restless, trembling, even feverish. Then came the roaring, the biting of shields, the overwhelming desire to kill. Once the fury took hold, he would feel no pain, show no fear, and fight without hesitation. After the battle, however, he might collapse in weakness, exhaustion, or even guilt. Some sagas describe berserkers falling into a deep sleep after their rage passed, unable to move for hours or days. Collapse is familiar in modern psychology. It resembles certain dissociative states, adrenal overload, or even trauma responses. In that sense, berserker gang might be seen as a weaponized form of extreme stress. But for the Norse, it was something far more mystical. The sacred aspect of the berserker also appears in their relationship with animals. Bears and wolves were more than symbols, they were spirits. A warrior who wore a bear pelt wasn't just dressing up, he was inviting the bear spirit into himself. The wolf, known for its wildness and loyalty to the pack, was equally sacred. In fact, the Ulfhead Nartha wolf warriors were often seen as even more mysterious than the berserkers. They may have been elite shock troops or religious cultists who lived on the edge of society. Animal symbolism ran deep in Norse culture. Ravens, wolves, and bears all appear in myths, often linked to gods. Odin himself is followed by two wolves, Geri and Freki, and two ravens, Hugin and Munin. By taking on the traits of these creatures, the berserker aligned himself with divine forces. In doing so, he stepped outside normal human experience and paid the price. Society both admired and feared them. They were heroes in times of war, but dangerous in times of peace. Some legends tell of berserkers attacking friends or family during uncontrollable rages. Their fury could be seen as a blessing on the battlefield, but a curse at home. This duality, sacred and savageous, what makes them so fascinating. As Christianity spread, this duality became intolerable. The berserkers' rage, once seen as holy, was now viewed as demonic. Their practices were outlawed, their symbols were erased. But their memory endured in stories, in whispers, and in fear. Centuries after their last roar echoed across the battlefield, berserkers remain a mystery. Were they mystical warriors who truly became beasts in battle? Or were they just men, using drugs, madness, or performance to strike fear into their enemies? Modern science has tried to uncover the truth behind the myth. Some researchers suggest that the berserker rage was induced by substances, hallucinogens, alcohol, or herbal mixtures. The most frequently mentioned theory is the use of Amanita muscaria, the red-capped mushroom with white spots. It's known for its psychoactive properties and has been used by shamans in Siberia. Taken in the right amount, it can produce delirium, aggression, and numbness to pain, but taken in the wrong amount, it can cause sickness or death. There is, however, no direct archaeological evidence of this mushroom being used by Norse warriors. Another theory points to alcohol. A strong brew consumed before battle could help numb pain and reduce fear. Combined with chanting, drumming, and group rituals, it might have created a frenzy. But alcohol also dulls reflexes. Berserkers were said to fight with incredible speed and strength. Some scholars argue that the berserker gang was a form of psychological conditioning. Repeated exposure to violence, combined with specific breathing techniques and extreme physical training, may have allowed warriors to enter dissociative states. These states, similar to what some soldiers experience in modern combat, can dull pain, block emotion, and create tunnel vision. In this sense, berserker rage wasn't mystical, it was a primitive form of psychological warfare. Others believe the berserkers were simply acting. A terrifying reputation was a weapon in itself. If your enemies feared you before the first sword swing, you had already won half the battle. Shield biting, roaring, and fighting half-naked may have been a strategy to intimidate and shock. In a society built on honor and story, looking like a monster was just as valuable as fighting like one. But even if berserkers were just men, that doesn't make their story any less powerful. The human brain is capable of astonishing feats under stress. Adrenaline can boost strength and dull pain. The mind can be trained to overcome fear. Berserkers may have tapped into these instincts more deeply than anyone else. Archaeology offers few clear answers. Some graves believed to belong to elite warriors have been found with bear or wolf remains, possibly representing totem animals. But there's no definitive way to say, this was a berserker. The Norse left behind sagas, not documentaries. What survives is layered in symbolism, myth, and exaggeration. Berserkers were part of a warrior culture that valued bravery, strength, and fearlessness above all else. Whether they truly transformed into beasts, or simply believed they did, they crossed a line that most humans never would. They turned the battlefield into a sacred space. They made their own bodies into weapons of terror and legend. Today, the word berserk has become a synonym for wild rage. But in the old Norse world, it meant more. It meant sacrifice. It meant madness. It meant power, born of belief. So were berserkers real? Yes and no. They were real men, shaped by brutal times and wild lands. But they were also part of something larger, a mythology built on extremes, where gods walked among men and warriors could become monsters. Berserkers stood at the edge of that world, howling into the storm. And even now, centuries later, we still hear the echoes. For centuries, the tale of Vikings reaching America long before Columbus was dismissed as fantasy. But buried in ancient sagas and confirmed by modern discoveries lies a story that rewrites what we thought we knew about exploration and human endurance. This is the real story of Vinland, a mysterious land of wild grapes, fierce natives, and the bold Norsemen who dared to cross the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail. It all begins in the icy reaches of Greenland around the year 985. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, establishes a Norse colony along Greenland's southwestern coast. Life there is harsh. The climate is brutal, but the settlers, tough and resourceful, survive. Among them is Eric's son, Leif, a man whose name would later become legend. Leif Erikson grew up hearing rumors. Sailors whispered of lands sighted west of Greenland, lands shrouded in mist and mystery. One of these whispers came from Bjarni Herjolfsson, a merchant blown off course during a voyage. He never landed, but what he saw: dense forests, flat coastlines, and no ice burned into Leif's imagination. Around the year 1000, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and gathered a crew. His goal was not just to find this new land, but to explore, settle, and understand it. He sailed west with courage and supplies, navigating unknown waters in a clinker-built Nar, a Viking ship designed for long-distance trade and sea voyages. No maps, no compass. Just the stars, the wind, and ancestral instincts. After days at sea, the crew sighted a barren, rocky land. Leif named it Helluland, land of flat stones. This was likely the coast of Baffin Island in modern-day Canada. The Norse found little of interest, no timber, no game. They sailed south. The next land was greener and more promising. Leif called it Markland, forest land. Today, historians believe this was Labrador. Trees for shipbuilding and shelter grew thick here. But the expedition didn't stay. They kept sailing. Finally, they reached a place unlike any they had seen before. The climate was milder. Salmon filled the rivers. Grass grew lush. Grapes, wild grapes, were everywhere. Leif named the land Vinland, Wineland. The Norse built houses and settled for the winter, amazed at how rich and welcoming the land seemed compared to Greenland. But was this a permanent colony, or just a temporary outpost? That question has puzzled historians for centuries. The sagas, especially the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, tell slightly different stories. In one version, Leif discovers Vinland accidentally. In another, he sets out deliberately. But all agree on certain details: the abundance of resources, the encounters with native peoples, and the sense of awe at a land so different from their icy homeland. The Norse called the indigenous people Skrallings, a word that may have meant wretches or foreigners. The first meetings were peaceful. Trade occurred. Red cloth, milk, and iron tools exchanged for furs and pelts. But tension soon flared. In one saga, a Norse bull charges into the native camp, spooking them and igniting conflict. In another, a Viking kills a native in a misunderstanding. Either way, violence erupted. The settlers, outnumbered and vulnerable, retreated. The dream of a permanent Norse Vinland ended almost as soon as it began. Still, the impact was profound. The Norse had crossed the Atlantic and set foot on American soil nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. They had mapped parts of the North Atlantic unknown to the rest of Europe. They left behind legends, artifacts, and a legacy that would lie hidden beneath skepticism until modern times. For years, scholars treated the Vinland sagas as myths, too vague, too contradictory, and yet the names Helluland, Markland, Vinland pointed to real places. The descriptions of climate and geography matched the Canadian Atlantic coast. There were clues, if anyone dared to believe them. And then came the breakthrough, a windswept headland in Newfoundland called L'Anse Meadows. In the 1962nd, a quiet revolution began on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, were searching for evidence that could tie the Norse sagas to the physical world. Guided by local fishermen and drawn by stories of strange mounds and ruins, they came to a site called L'Anse Meadows. At first glance, it didn't look like much. Grassy knolls, exposed bedrock, peat bogs. But buried in that soil were answers. Over several summers of excavation, the Ingstads uncovered the unmistakable remains of Norse longhouses, blacksmithing forges, and boat repair workshops. The structures were built of sod, timber, and stone, exactly the way Viking houses were constructed in Iceland and Greenland. But it wasn't just the architecture. Iron nails, rivets, and a bronze cloak pin, all consistent with Viking-era materials, were found at the site. Carbon dating confirmed the timeline. Around the year 1000 CE, suddenly, the sagas weren't just oral legends passed down through generations. They were history, backed by evidence, standing in the soil of North America. L'Anse aux Meadows became the first and, to this day, only widely accepted site of pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. But what was its true purpose? Scholars now believe it was a base camp, a gateway to Vinland proper, which likely lay farther south. The Norse would have used it for repair, resupply, and staging exploration deeper into the continent. The location made sense. L'Anse aux Meadows offered a natural harbor, fresh water, and proximity to forests. But winters were harsh, and the surrounding land didn't match the lush descriptions of Vinland found in the sagas. There were no wild grapes in Newfoundland. However, wild grapes do grow farther south, in areas like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and even Maine. This suggests the Norse explored well beyond what they built. They likely traveled by sea and river in smaller boats. Some sagas describe voyages lasting days beyond the base camp. They may have reached richer lands but chose not to settle due to hostilities with local peoples or simply because they lacked the numbers to maintain distant colonies. What remains undeniable is the ambition. These were people not only brave enough to cross the Atlantic, but curious enough to push deeper once they arrived. The saga texts support this. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Leif's brother Thorvald tries to establish a more permanent presence. He's killed by natives during a skirmish, and his men flee. Another brother, Thorstein, attempts to recover the body but dies before reaching Vinland. Later, a woman named Gudrid, one of the most remarkable figures in the sagas, makes her own voyage and gives birth to the first known child of European descent born in North America, a boy named Snorri. Gudrid's story is unique. A widow, traveler, and later a pilgrim to Rome, she lived a life that crossed oceans and cultures. Her journey to Vinland wasn't just about survival. It was about faith, exploration, and the promise of a new world. The sagas portray her as wise and respected, and her role adds a deeply human layer to the story of Norse America. Still, the dream of a permanent Norse presence in Vinland faded. The settlements in Greenland persisted for centuries longer, but no other Norse site in the Americas has yet been confirmed. Why did the Vinland experiments fail? There were many reasons. The Norse were few in number. The journey was perilous. Supplies had to be brought from Greenland, itself a fragile outpost. Relations with the indigenous peoples were unstable and often hostile. Perhaps most crucially, the Norse didn't come with the intent of conquest. They lacked the logistical strength to build an empire or defend a colony in the wilderness. They were traders, explorers, and survivors, not invaders. And yet they left a trace, a saga, a memory, and, eventually, a discovery that would change how we understand the history of the New World. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he was unaware that others had gone before him, that on distant shores Norse axes had cut trees, their forges had burned hot, and their people had gazed into the same forests and rivers with wonder. The story of Lanzo Meadows isn't just about proving the saga's true, it's about rethinking who the first explorers really were, and how far curiosity and courage can carry a people across the unknown. The Norse presence in North America, while brief, planted a seed that continues to spark fascination over 1,000 years later. The story of Vinland challenges the traditional narrative of discovery and forces us to reconsider what exploration truly means, not as a single moment of triumph, but as a scattered collection of attempts, failures, and fleeting contacts across distant shores. The rediscovery of Lanzo Meadows gave the saga traditions a credibility they had long been denied. But the mystery hasn't been solved, only deepened. Was Vinland a single location, or a broad term for multiple coastal areas explored by the Norse? Was it Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or even farther south along the eastern seaboard? Clues remain, scattered in the sagas, in soil, and in oral traditions that may hold forgotten truths. Some researchers argue that Vinland extended much farther than previously thought. The presence of wild grapes in the sagas suggests a location at least as far south as New Brunswick, or possibly even New England. Timber descriptions match trees not native to Newfoundland. The sagas mention long days, mild winters, and fertile ground, all suggesting a richer, warmer landscape than what we find at Lanzo Meadows. Speculation has gone even further. Some fringe theories place Norse explorers in the interior of North America, citing stone carvings, strange artifacts, or genetic traces. While most lack scholarly support, they point to a deep desire to know more, to trace a path that history has left mostly obscured. Yet even if no other sites are ever confirmed, the Norse in North America represent something profound. Their journey was the first known contact between Europe and the American continent. It wasn't conquest, colonization, or empire building. It was something older and more human, a search for opportunity, for trade, for land, for survival. They came in wooden ships across an ocean barely understood, with no certainty of what lay ahead, and they made it. The Vinland sagas themselves are more than just historical documents. They are cultural artifacts shaped by the times in which they were written. blending fact with memory, and colored by the values of the Norse world. Heroism, fate, honor, and exploration are constant themes. They reflect a people who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a path. In these stories, Vinland isn't just a place. It's a symbol of potential, a frontier, a glimpse into a world that could have been where Europe met the Americas in a different way, centuries before the age of sail. A meeting not of conquest, but of curiosity, not of domination, but of contact. Modern archaeology continues to search for answers. Satellite imaging, soil analysis, and advanced dating techniques are being used to look for other Norse sites. Small clues, a bit of iron, a foundation stone, a buried tool could someday open new chapters in the Vinland story. Until then, much remains speculative, but the spirit of exploration continues. In Scandinavia, Vinland has become part of national identity, a proud reminder of the seafaring skill and daring ambition of the Viking Age. In North America, the site at Lance aux Meadows stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserving the evidence of that brief and bold Norse experiment. In the end, perhaps the true legacy of Vinland is not its location, but its lesson. That history is not always linear, that great achievements can be forgotten, buried, and rediscovered. That sometimes the boldest journeys don't end in empire or glory, but in a quiet footprint on a distant shore, waiting to be found again. The Norse came to America, not in waves, not with armies, not to conquer but to explore. They saw forests where others saw fog. They found rivers where others found myths. They crossed an ocean with no maps and reached a world that would not be fully known for centuries. And then, like so many great explorers, they turned back. But their stories did not fade. And neither did their mark on history.